The hard part about Aikido is learning not to contract so much, because this is just a reflex, what we do. Eventually, when you train and you keep all those ideas in mind, you will eventually get an outer core, a physical core that looks very Aiki and very strong. In this sense, with the weapons, the weapons are become part of your body. We learn the weapons, and right away we learn them in Aikido because we see them not as different and not as separate. They all complement each other. And when you strike the sword or hold the jo, so often your body will just naturally map the length of anything. And sort of like, if you were a carpenter, you know where the end of the hammer is. You don't have to look.
I'm finding that Aikido also interfaces, part of the reason it became interested to me in this part of my life after having chronic illness and accumulating a lot of injuries in other martial arts. I'm noticing that I'm more interested in yoga and meditation and transformation, really.
Yeah.
And it's taken me about a year to understand that Aikido is in fact a transformative or purificatory practice. And I had heard this from Nathan Sensei, another teacher that I study with, that it's an inner martial art first.
Mm-hmm.
And although one could say that all martial arts actually come from a monastery or some, who grew up watching Kung Fu movies and stuff. But as I was saying earlier, Aikido, it's not hidden. The ritual, the prayer,
Right.
the respect, all those deeper qualities that a warrior has to cultivate are available from day one. And in your case, it seems like you were, in a way, forged in fire to have to cultivate some of those things.
Yeah, I think it's been good work. Staying in Aikido, I have to admit, many times I wanted to quit because it was quite frustrating initially at first. But staying with it, I'm glad I did. And actually, I have my husband to thank for that, and my teacher, Goto Sensei, who's just always been incredibly supportive, a champion of a person. And I'm so glad I stayed because I've learned tremendous things. The discipline of Aikidos, yes, it starts with the technique, the kata. And you do the kata and you work on your techniques in class over and over again. Learning is a series of layering. It's a series of learning, unlearning, and relearning. At first, your teacher will tell you your technique. You need to improve this and that. And your hamni is off. You need more extension. And then you do it. And then you remember the next time that technique comes up, you're more mindful.
And by hamni, you mean the stance?
Oh, yeah, the stance. Yes, the stance. And those are the general corrections you often get. Your feet are wrong or whatever. But if you stay with that mindfulness and you kind of make it part of who you are, you start to see other techniques maintain the same principles, and you look for patterns, and then you learn more. But if you come to class and just do things by rote, and don't invest in your own study, and I'm really into do your own study, you could progress slower. So I was always curious about finding patterns so that it could alleviate my frustration. And then they show themselves after a while. Eventually, you become mindful throughout the entire class, and then eventually you become mindful in Aikido on the mat, period, and then you take it off the mat. Your mindfulness will follow you into your everyday life, and then you spend so much time on the mat blending and connecting and harmonizing. You start to do that with your family, with the people you work with, or strangers in a store. And it's a very fascinating thing when you catch yourself doing these things. It does kind of overflow into those areas.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful quality of Aikido, is that those qualities that are cultivated, transformational qualities, just flow out into the world and our interactions and
yes.
How we live our life.
Yeah. And if you're intuitive enough, you'll pick it up I do have to admit there was one student I had a man who was in his 70s, and he was roughhousing with a woman. She was a first cue, but he was being pretty rough with her. After class, I told him he needed to maybe connect with her a little bit more, and he was like, he didn't understand what I was saying. And so I tried to give him the analogy of being with his wife in the store, because, I said, do you go grocery shopping? And he said, yes. And I said, do you push the cart? And he says, yes. And so I said, well, I bet you when you push the cart, you keep up with her putting things in the cart, right? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, well, if you didn't, everything would fall on the floor. So this is what you do in Aikido. You connect with your person, your uke, and you only go as fast as they're able. Unless you're very interested in hurting them. And that's really not part of the philosophy. He put his hands up in the air and said, why didn't anybody ever tell me? And so sometimes you think it would come upon you, but some people, maybe not so much, depending on where they are in life. So after that incident, I thought, I'm really not going to hold back. And I'll say this should be happening. I'll say why, and I'll say bring it into your life, because you can't always guarantee people will pick it up, and even when you say it, they might not pick it up. But at least it's said, So I'll put it out there and see what happens.
Yeah, I think it's so important, and thank you for doing that. You do that in your writing, and kind of to circle back, you've written some articles which I feel like form a great trajectory of how you see the learning of Aikido and development. And so you wrote this series of 3 articles in the Aikido Journal of Europe.
Yes,
Which is a journal by Luis Bernaldo Sensei.
De Queiroz, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Who's a very well-known sensei in Europe, I believe.
Yes.
Right. So in this article, you started with the outer training, the exterior, meaning the structure and the form. And then gradually it leads you to more the inner subtlety and the inner dynamics of the art. Mm-hmm. Could you say more about how does that trajectory look like, or how does that happen?
Yeah, so like with anything, or at least there are many ways to learn. A linear path is starting, very simply with foot A, foot B, and arm C and arm D, right? And then after people get that and they become very acquainted with it, you give them another layer about, making their stance good and central axis intact, so their posture is always nice. And eventually they get an outer core, the Aiki body, they call it. It looks like a body that you can put a weapon in the hands, and then you can take the weapons out, and then they hold the same shape. So that would be your Aiki body, and you maintain that shape through all your techniques. So the hard part about Aikido is learning not to contract so much, because this is just a reflex, what we do. Eventually, when you train and you keep all those ideas in mind, you will eventually get an outer core, a physical core that looks very Aiki and very strong. And so then after you have that, we might go more internal with your breath. We start with the breath, because often, the exhale will make you naturally heavy, and you can feel it in your own body when you do that. You can sink, bend the knees, and the knees are big because the knees do more than just bend. They absorb, they redirect, they flex, they do many things, and so you have to kind of incorporate that part of your body. And then, integration of the body to be one whole unit is a very hard skill, because we're going from the outside in instead of the inside out. And so after you have that outer core, you learn how to connect the segmented parts of the body, because sometimes we move segmented. Only arms move, or maybe only legs move, which means you lose the potential power in the big muscles in the back or the big muscles in the legs. So the goal is to incorporate the whole body and to coordinate it so that when one part moves, all parts move. And this requires an awareness and also a desire to go there. Because many people do Aikido quite well just externally, and you can go on like that for years. For me, it was always a goal to find different ways to get bigger, and so when my outer core looked pretty good and I felt like my weapons were intact and I was feeling like they were extensions of my body, the next part for me was, how do I get bigger? And I realized, okay, I kind of maxed out the exterior part, so I went inward. I took yoga for years, 10 years. I still practice, and I learned about the spaces in the body that I never knew. I was incorporating parts of my body like the big toe I'd never used before, which was very amazing. It was all so astounding. And then COVID came and everything shut down. So my study started going into interesting things like Tai Chi. And so I read a lot about that internal aspect. And I finally found, after COVID, a master instructor, an amazing teacher. And I'm learning about the yin and yang of the body. And once again, the opening and closing of joints, and how to lengthen and extend and create potential power. And I played with it with my Aikido, and, it's a tremendous part of everything. Even the basics of rooting is huge. So, it's almost like there's always a place to grow. And so I feel like I've increased a lot dimension-wise. And I like to study the stuff, so I've got a background in biology, so it's not foreign, these muscles. And so I find it fascinating. I have a huge regard for the internal system of your body. Your body is an amazing thing. Yeah. Yes, and we often take it for granted. Yeah. Only when it doesn't work, we're like, oh no, what's going on? So.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you were saying, often we have either we live in a culture where we are averse to the internal aspects of our psyche. We're considering ourselves, just as bodies and made of physical. And yet, as some of us embark on that spiritual journey, I recognize more and more that even the differentiation between the external and internal is unnecessary, because if you're very open, the external very quite quickly leads you to the internal. Mm-hmm. And I saw that highlighted in the journey as you were laying it out. And so often one of the things I noticed, as you were saying, was this body is a remarkable machine. And even after partaking in dance and other martial arts, as I come into Aikido, a new martial arts, I was like, oh, I don't really know that my hands could be like blades. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? And there is an entire new dimension of movements and possibility that becomes open when the edges of your hands or your elbows are now a sword. Yes. And so I find that very remarkable, that in a way that's a form of embodiment. It's a dimension of the vessel that, if you're driving a car, that you didn't even know that it has those buttons or those mechanisms. Right. And you were highlighting that the weapons allow you to, one of the principles they allow you with is to expand and not be contracted. Right. And it has both physical and spiritual implications.
The concept is generally referred to as riai, which is an underlying truth. In this sense, with the weapons, the weapons are become part of your body. We learn the weapons, and right away we learn them in Aikido because we see them not as different and not as separate. They all complement each other. And when you strike the sword or hold the jo, so often your body will just naturally map the length of anything. And sort of like, if you were a carpenter, you know where the end of the hammer is. You don't have to look. And if you wield the sword long enough, or the jo, you know where the tip ends, and you just feel it, right? And when you put your sword down and you extend your hand out, you still feel the tip. That's what happens when you embody the weapon in your body, and you become more expanded, you become bigger. And this is one of the things that actually was quite telling for me in my journey. I became huge, I felt, with my weapons, and I was no longer afraid to train with the biggest guy in the group if I had weapons, especially, and that transferred into my body to the point where it was pretty amazing. What you see as your center line changed into a center wall for me, and when that happened, I was no longer afraid of doing any kind of entry because I knew the distance and I knew that I was safe, even if I kind of got brushed on the side with a gi or a punch. It was fine. I had dodged the movement, and yeah, that's huge. That's huge. Having the sword become part of your body and having the jo become part of your body. In every technique, I look for the sword and jo because it refines my movement. It also aligns me so that I have my body completely behind the technique, and I'm not segmented, and I have every ounce that I have is incorporated behind my movement. And I need that to happen, otherwise I would be unable to move bigger people.
Mm-hmm. Quite a few thoughts are coming to me, but as this connection with the bigger people, I read in your article you were saying that you had to master your technique because sometimes your students, out of the goodness of their heart, would surrender, and that surrender meant that if they're 4 times your body weight, that weight is now being on top of you.
Yeah.
So you have to learn to maneuver in a different way and polish your technique, I guess, to another level.
Yeah, you can do it. You can do it. I've had many men surrender their entire weight on me. I got hurt one time from it, but then you learn. Then you learn, okay, that was the wrong place to be. And I also did a lot of physics in school, so I understand where I need to be a support when that happens and to take care of myself. Those angles are so precise, and but they're accessible. They're accessible to anybody, and they're so profound because now that I see things coming to an interesting place with science. Science is so separated from spirituality for so long, and now I see that science is coming around, especially the stuff they're doing in physics and quantum mechanics, and quantum entanglement, those kinds of really bizarre things. So what happens in what we studied in school, which was Newtonian physics, the physics that you can reproduce and everybody can see, the A plus B equals C. It's very clear. Doesn't happen in the subatomic world. There's a completely different relationship subatomically, and we are made of those subatomic particles. So in that sense, the A plus B equals C is not so clear. It's more relational. It's more inclined and probable, and so but possible. So that you've got a whole different realm of study there that they're finally starting to get into, and I think it's just fascinating. There's so much out there.